Really, what an incredible day that must have been 2,000 years ago today, 2,000 years ago, give or take. When all these crowds of people assembled together at some signal, I don't know what it was, how it all happened, but they assembled together and began to line the streets. I guess it's when they saw Jesus coming, they began to line the streets going into Jerusalem. And they broke off these palm branches and they laid them in the way for Jesus to walk down. These palm fronds were symbolic. These were things that were reserved for victorious conquerors, for conquerors coming back from battle. And they would line the streets and they're taking the clothes off their back and laying that in the road as Jesus comes into town, riding on the king's choice of transport back in the day, riding on the back of a donkey. I don't want you to get the idea that this is some sort of something where the crowds of people got all caught up in sort of the electricity of the moment and they get together and they shout out, "Hosanna! Hosanna to God in the highest." You see, because the one coming into town there was not just king of Jerusalem. He wasn't just king of ancient Israel. He wasn't just king of modern day Israel. He's not just king of modern day America. He's not just king of the planet. He's not just king of the universe. He's not just king of everything that we know and see and detect. He's king of everything that we don't know and that we don't see and that we can't detect. All the unseen things. He's king and He's master. And He's not just king. He's King of kings. And He's Lord of lords. And He came into town that day very poetically on the one hand, but very strategically on the other hand. He comes into town that day making a proclamation about who He is. And oddly enough, and paradoxically enough, as both Roger and Taylor talked about, it was an agonizing moment. A moment of betrayal and a moment of suffering, because later that week, 5 days later, by 3 o'clock in the afternoon, next Friday, 5 days from now, 2,000 years ago, our Master would hang lifeless on that cross. The irony is that the same people that were shouting out, "Hosanna, glory to God in the highest" on Sunday, 5 days later were crying out, "Crucify Him, crucify Him. We have no king but Caesar." They must have choked on those words as they came out of their mouths. We're so fickle. But behind those accolades, and it's in his mind, I thought Roger said that well as he got us ready for the Lord's Supper. On his mind is behind those accolades is the horror of the week. And listen, y'all, here's what really makes it horrible in my mind. Yes, he knew what was coming up. He had already been predicting it for some time. He knew what was coming up. But the fact that he did it alone. I mean, he was all by himself. And when I say that, I'm not just talking about the betrayal of the disciples on Thursday night when they turned tail and ran and hit the bushes. I'm not just talking about that, or the one that betrayed Him for 30 pieces of silver. I'm talking about the fact that nobody there really, I mean, yes, they're saying Hosanna, but they didn't have an understanding about really what they were saying or what they were doing. Even at the crucifixion, nobody really understood. He was all alone in that. And maybe it's captured best. And here's a passage that we've talked about before, and that's all right, if we talk about passages more than once. But it pops into my brain right now. It's in Mark chapter 10. And it's not about the triumphal entry, but it's about leading right up to the triumphal entry. The triumphal entry in the book of Mark starts in chapter 11 and verse 1. This is chapter 10 and verse 32. They're on the way to the triumphal entry. They're heading up to Jerusalem. They've been doing it for some time in the gospel, getting ready. And here's what it says in verse 32. They were on their way up to Jerusalem with Jesus leading the way, and the disciples were astonished, while those who followed were afraid. And again, and this is, by the way, the third time since chapter 8, again, He took the 12 aside and told them what was going to happen to Him. "We're going up to Jerusalem," He said, "and the Son of Man will be betrayed to the chief priests and teachers of the law. They will condemn Him to death. They'll hand Him over to the Gentiles." Do you see His eyes searching their faces as He says this? "They'll turn Him over to the Gentiles, who will mock Him, spit on Him, flog Him, and kill Him. And 3 days later He will rise." Now see, here's the astounding thing. Nobody asked Him a question about it. In fact, you know what their response was? James and John come up and say, "By the way, when you come in your kingdom, can you let me sit on your right hand and my brother sit on your left hand?" Matthew says that their mother was in on the deal. "We're all that and more, so would you let us come in your kingdom. He's talking about really the culmination of so many things, and they're wrapped up in these things that really, what? You know what that is so me. That's not James and John down there. That's me. And then it turns into a dogfight because the other 10 find out they're all indignant because they think these guys are promoting themselves. And that's always ugly, isn't it? They think they're promoting themselves, and so they jump up and they're complaining about all of it. And here you are. Jesus has just said what he said. And here's nobody understands. And it's really, look at verse 32 again. Get the picture in mind. They were on their way up to Jerusalem with Jesus leading the way. He's out in front of everybody. Here's what we've talked about before. I just want you to get it in your mind. He's out in front of everybody. Everybody's following him. The disciples are overwhelmed. The crowds are afraid. He goes knowing not one single person behind him understands, even knows what he's going through. Nobody knows. I said to no one there, and no one heard it all, not even a chair, leaving me lonely still. Neil Diamond, I think one of the great poets of the 20th century, wrote those words. I don't know that he had had this on his mind at all, but it sure fits, doesn't it? And it makes all that more acute, those words that Jesus cried out on the cross as he hung there, hung there, saying, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, my God, why have you forsaken me? Even to repeat the words, it just sort of trivializes the event, doesn't it? How do you capture that? All alone. Have you ever done something, gone through something difficult, maybe painful, maybe, I don't know what adjectives you would stick in there, but gone through something and felt like there was no one that understood? Has that ever happened to you? Felt like nobody had a real handle on what you were going through? What kind of words would you use to describe that? I want to tell you, I can do anything with a friend. I can do anything with a friend, but alone? And on the other hand, if you're facing something and you catch wind that maybe somebody else has gone through it, maybe somebody else it's happened to them as well, what's one of the first things you do? You seek them out. You try to go find out, what was it like? And are the things that I'm feeling, are those the things? We seek out those folks that have gone through it before. And as soon as somebody turns to you and they say, I understand, there's a connection right there. And by the way, we're wired for connection, right? We were made that way. There's a connection right there. Something passes between the two of you. Some sacred something passes between the two of you, having been made sacred through that common bit of suffering. Makes it real. I understand. There's no sweeter words ever spoken, nothing more precious than for someone to say to you when you're in need, to say, I understand. And nothing makes understanding more concrete. Nothing makes it more tactile, more in your throat than suffering. To share together in something. You know somebody. You know that they understand. Now I want to tell you the honest truth. What I've just described to you is what Jesus initiated. It's what Jesus did. It's what Jesus accomplished that day at Calvary. This connection through understanding, that's what he was all about. And you know why he did it? I want to tell you right now, I don't believe it on the one hand. It's hard for me to believe. It seems odd for me to say that, for a preacher to say that in the church house, isn't it? But it's hard to believe. He did it because he loved us. And I don't know a lot of you, but I know me. I'm thinking, how in the world? Why in the world? In terms of fickleness alone, James and John, what is that? They don't hold a candle to my junk. He did it because he loved me. Now listen, that love has changed my life, and I believe it's changed the life of lots of you guys. And some of you that it has not touched yet, you're out here today and you're hungry. There's something you want. You may not even be able to really grasp it yet. You may not even be able to, you're not sure exactly what it is, but it's that longing to connect. Let me tell you, it comes from God. It's God, it's Him. And that's who you're hungry for. That love changes you. And I want to tell you the truth. Any love that changes lives has a substitutional sacrifice involved in that. Hang with me here. There's a substitutional exchange that goes on. If it's a love that changes lives, has there ever been any kind of love in your life that's changed your life? If there's a love that changes life, let me tell you what a piece of that is. It's the central piece. Substitutional sacrifice. Substitutional exchange. You see it a lot of times with husbands and wives as they grow closer together over the years. And it's a relationship where each share in the other person's weakness. Substitutional in that their weakness, you take it in, and the strength that you have goes to them, and vice versa. And over time, you're bound together. Whether it's husband to wife or friend to friend, maybe the best place to see it is with kids. It's in parenting. Now think about this just for a second. Kids come into the world totally dependent. Totally dependent. Totally inadequate. There's no thing that they're adequate for. That's how kids come into the world. Totally dependent and totally adequate. And as parents, we realize that if they're ever going to become independent, if they're ever going to become adequate, if they're ever going to be free, it's because we sacrifice our own freedom and our own independence for a lot of years. But when we do that, you see, our strength goes to their weakness and we enter into their weakness. Do you see what I'm saying? Give me a nod. Do you see what I'm saying? Their weakness becomes ours. And there's a substitutional exchange. There's a substitutional sacrifice. And there's a choice that parents have to make. It's either us or them. It's either we hang on to our freedom or we let them have our freedom so that they can one day have what we have. Independence, adequacy, freedom. There's no other way. They must increase as we decrease. That's the love that changes lives. You hear what I'm saying? That's the love that changes lives. Now let me ask you, if God is a God of love, and I believe that He is, don't you? Anybody in here doubt that? If God is a God of love, how could He possibly love us enough to change us? How could He possibly engage us if He had never entered into our suffering, our oppression, our grief, our pain, our misery, our failure, our rejection, our temptation? How could He ever change us? The answer to that question is, He can't. God can't. God can do anything, I know that, but He can't do this. He can't extend to us a life-changing love without entering into those things for us and having that substitutional exchange, that substitutional sacrifice. You see, that's right at the heart of it. There's no way to get around that. I said something at Christmas, and we're kind of coming full circle here as we went from Christmas to Easter, the beginning of things and the kind of end of things as far as this physical life is concerned. And relationship, I made a statement then, whether you remember it or not, it doesn't matter because I'm getting ready to say it again. Relationships develop because of vulnerability. Somebody makes themselves weak, open, vulnerable to the other person. When God came, He came as a baby. He came as a being that we could hurt. He came as a being that we could destroy. Now, why did He do that? He did that because He wanted to get us back. And there's no way to get us back. There's no way to move us by love except that He take on our suffering. And His strength flows to our weakness, and our weakness flows to His strength. And I want to tell you the honest truth. There is no religion in the world that says anything like that. Some of these comparative religion folks that say it's all the same and it's all man's need for whatever and blah, blah, blah. It's ridiculous. There's no religion in the world that says they have a God that did anything like that. A God that became vulnerable, a God that became a baby, a God that embraced suffering, a God that died? Are you kidding me? A God that died? God can't die, I know, but He did it just the same, didn't He? He did it for one reason, to win us. To win us by love, not by power as in Islam. Not by some hocus-pocus thing as in Buddhism and Hinduism and all that. And I respect the folks. Don't misunderstand me at all. I respect and appreciate the people. But come on, y'all. This is the only thing in the world that projects a God, that proclaims a God that loves people so much that He enters into our junk. And He takes it on Himself. You can't go anywhere. You couldn't be anywhere else in the world and hear something more life-changing than that. There it is. That's what He did. What really happened that day? That's what happened that day. And here we are 2,000 years later, and it is still plucking us out of the fire. It is still pulling us into life, still changing us. Now, let me tell you something else. That's the same thing that the Hebrew writer says in Hebrews chapters 1 and 2. I want to say that on the front end because I want you to let the message of this first 2 chapters of Hebrews just fill up your soul and carry you through the week as we move toward Easter next Sunday. All right? Hebrews chapter 1 and 2. Look at chapter 1 just for a moment. Verses 1, 2, 3, and 4. Well, we're going to do this quickly. But the Hebrew writer begins to talk about this being that we have to deal with. Or maybe I should say, this being that deals with us. And look at how he describes him. Let your eyes just flow through there. Look at that screen just for a second. Let your eyes flow through this. By the way, he starts off in verse 1 with an assumption. The assumption, he doesn't state it, but look at that. Look at verse 1. He makes an assumption. You know what his assumption is? God speaks to His creation. That's the assumption. Not maybe He speaks or not. He speaks. God always speaks to His creation. He doesn't leave us here alone. Yeah, we're wired for connection. He's the one that makes it possible, right? So He speaks to His people. Always. And now He's speaking through someone that He describes. Look at how He describes it. Look at verses 1, 2, 3, and 4. In fact, look at the last few words of verse 4. This one that He speaks through now is one who has inherited a name superior to angels. That was particularly relevant to the Jewish crowd that the Hebrew writer is writing to. By the way, just so you know, maybe you did know this, but let me refresh you again. The book of Hebrews was written to a bunch of Jews who had become Christians who were thinking about leaving it all behind and going back to Judaism, or maybe at least syncretizing Judaism and Christianity. And those Jews believed there was a high angelology among the Jewish tradition because of the angel of the Lord references and all that sort of thing in the Old Testament. They had a big, huge concept of angels, and that the Old Testament, they believe, was delivered through the agency of angels. And he is saying in chapter 1, angels? What is angels? What are angels? This one has inherited a name superior to angels. You know what that name is? Son. To what angel did God ever look and say, Son? Son. Sit right here at my right hand by my majesty on high. Son. That's who deals with us. Son, who created all things, who is heir of all things, who sustains all things. That's what he says in those first 4 verses. And he says it almost as an afterthought. Look at verse 4. He says it as an afterthought. Put verse 4 back up on the screen. Here's what he says as an afterthought. He says, after He made purification for sins, He sat down at the right hand of the majesty on high. After He made purification for sin, it sounds so clinical and it sounds so easy. After He made purification for sins. Do you realize we're nothing without that? We are nothing without that. For all of our stuff and all of our things, we're nothing without that. What is that? Imagine in your mind just for a moment Calvary. And you see the Lamb suspended there between heaven and earth, and words are bankrupt to describe it. You ever notice in the Old Testament, in the New Testament, there's no description ever given of the crucifixion. They all knew what it was like. They knew what it was like. They lived in that Roman world. We couldn't begin to describe it after being beaten with a whip. By the way, some people say He was whipped 39 times with a... That was a Jewish law. Romans could beat you as long as they wanted to. And I think I've shared this with you before, that Josephus writes that a lot of times a person would be left standing in the middle of his own intestines. They were literally cut out of his body as that whip would wrap around. So here He is hanging on the cross. He's nailed to this cross. And you know what happens? You have to move on the cross in order to breathe. And you know what happens when you when you try to stop breathing, however long it is that you can hold your breath, do you know what your body finally does? It takes over. And it spasmodically jerks into movement to draw breath. So here's Jesus hanging on this cross, this lacerated back rubbing up against this rough-hewn cross, his body hanging by spikes through his wrist and through his feet. And whether the weight is on his feet or the weight is in his hands, it's crushing those nerve endings. And every time he moves, all that pain joins together in some this kind of chorus. And I can't imagine him doing anything but crying out. Now, if you can imagine that, you know where you are? You're at Calvary. But you know what you're looking at? Purification for sins. And all of a sudden we get a picture of what sin really is and the ugliness of it and the horribleness of it. There's no picture, there's no vision like that. That's purification for sin. Now, you know why He did that? I know I said a moment ago it's because He loves us. But understand the way the Hebrew writer puts it. Here's what he says. That you and I are the crown of creation. Jesus didn't die for the whales. He didn't die for the natural order and to save the environment. He died because we're rotten. And we are the crowning pinnacle of God's creation. Look at chapter 2. Let your eyes flip over to about verse 6 in Hebrews chapter 2. Here's what he says. He says, what is man that you're mindful of him, the Son of Man that you care for him? You made him a little lower than the angels. You crowned him with glory and honor and put everything under his feet. He's talking about us. He's talking about Jesus, the man of mans. But he's talking about us. We're the ones that's been the focus of God's affection and God's attention. In putting everything under him, God left nothing that is not subject to him. Yet at present, we do not see everything subject to him. You don't, do you? Disease riddles us, and sickness riddles us, and death riddles us. But, verse 9, but, we see Jesus, the man's man, who was made a little lower than the angels, just like we are. We see Him, what? Now crowned with glory and honor because He suffered death. That so by the grace of God He might taste death for everyone. Did you get that? He's crowned with glory and honor. Why? Why is He crowned with glory and honor? Because He suffered death. Folks, here's the reason for the incarnation. Here's the whole reason. If anybody was born to die, it was Him. You can't die as a human unless you're born as a human. In fact, He explains it. Look at verse 10. In bringing many sons to glory, that's us, it was fitting. Fitting? It was fitting that God, for whom and through whom everything exists, should make the author of their salvation perfect through suffering. Perfect through suffering? I thought He was already perfect. Did you read that description of Him in the first 4 verses of chapter 1? He's already perfect. Yes. He's the perfect Son of God. Now He is the perfect Son of Man. Because there's no experience of life to which He cannot say, I've been there. And now you know and I know that something can pass between us and Him because He understands. He understands. There's no message like that anywhere. And so watch Him wrap this up in chapter 2. It starts with verse 14, but let's drop down verse 17. For this reason, He had to be made like His brothers in every way. He had to be made like us in every way. In order that, 2 things. In order that He might become a merciful and faithful high priest in service to God. That's number 1. Now, he goes on to talk about what this high priest thing means, and we're not here to talk about that today. We don't have the time to do that, all right? But merciful, what I want you to focus on is what kind of high priest is he? He is a faithful high priest. He is a merciful high priest. Why is he merciful? Because there's nothing that he's not endured. Every grief, every pain, every oppression, every rejection, every misery has fallen upon him. And when you have that same thing, and you come to him, you know you're coming to a high priest that understands. There's no way you can put a dollar amount on that. Merciful, because he's been there. Right? And, number two, he had to be made like his brothers in every way. Not only to qualify him, but, number two, still in that verse, and that he might make atonement for the sins of the people. Pay our penalty. Set us free and draw us in. Set us free, draw us in. Set us free, draw us in. So, do you understand? Verse 18. Because he himself suffered when he was tempted, he is able to help those who are being tempted. He understands. Whatever your junk is, whatever reason you've done the dumb things that you've done, you think that, let me tell you something. He understands. Listen, there was a sign that popped up in Chicago back in 2009, a billboard. Big, huge billboard popped up in 2009. It says, here's what it's all it said. Are you good without God? Millions are! Exclamation point. Well, it caused quite a stir up in Chicago when it appeared. Are you good without God? Millions are. Turns out, and by the way, those signs filtered out away from Chicago and started popping up all over the country. Turns out they were put up there by the Chicago Coalition for a reason. R-E-A-S-O-N. And they did that to help folks that are atheist or agnostic or whatever name you want to call that, who are feeling isolated and alone because they're living in a world filled with religious worldview. Not just Christianity, but every kind of religious worldview. So they raised the question, are you good without God? Millions are. And the deal behind all of it is, can you be good? Can you be a good person without God? Can people that don't believe in God do good things? Well, the answer to that is, yeah. They can do good things. But the response to the New Testament is, that's not the question. Not can you do good things. What's in your soul? What's in your heart? Are you good without God? We're terrible without God. We're lost without God. We're undone in every way without God. So that's why he says what he says in chapter 2. Right in the middle of all of this, in Hebrews 2, look at your screen just for a second. He says, listen, don't let this get away from you. Isn't that what he's saying in verse 1? Look at verse 1. Isn't that what he's saying? Don't drift away. That's what we all do. We drift, right? Don't let it get away from you. Chapter 2 and verse 1. Don't let it get away. Hang on, because Jesus is coming back, and he says there's going to be a day of judgment. That sounds kind of ominous, but I want you to understand clearly what he's saying there. Is there a final judgment coming? Absolutely. A judgment that is final. But it's being carried out by a judge. This judgment that is final is being carried out by a judge who loves us fully. Fully. No experience of life to which he cannot say, I've been there. What did the Father think through all this? I need to quit, but I just got to tell you this real quickly. What was it like for the Father to witness all of this? I really got in touch with that with a book by John Mark Hicks. Some of you may know him. He's a brother in our fellowship. He wrote a book that said, Yet Will I Trust Him. He has a little boy born to him named Joshua. And Joshua was born with Sanfilippo Syndrome A. Anybody in here know what that is outside of Dr. Sanders? Do you know what that is? You don't even know what that is. I'd never heard of it till I read this. Sanfilippo, John Mark Hicks talked about it once. Sanfilippo Syndrome A. It's a genetic disorder where physical and mental deterioration is the only end of the story. It's a horribly debilitating disorder. So as they're going along, he's kind of telling the story about all this, and he talks about the time that his son fell in love with school buses, big yellow buses. I want to ride, he would say. I want to ride. I want to ride. You know, on the one hand, he wanted to be like his big sister that rode the school bus. But he just said, I want to ride, with that kind of childhood exuberance, you know, that somehow or another we forget about or we lose on the way to adulthood as we get all big and mature. You know what I'm saying? So there it was. I said, I want to ride. And one day, of course, he couldn't. He was too little. Every time they would see one driving along or whatever, I want to ride. I want to ride. Finally, the day came when he could ride. And he went to the office with his dad because the school bus stopped right there outside of the office, and they began this ritual of getting on the bus and getting off the bus every day. And every time the bus would turn the corner and start coming down the street, little old Josh would start saying, he couldn't contain himself. He just could not contain himself. He was so excited about this. But one day, he didn't want to get on that bus all of a sudden. John Mark couldn't figure it out. He asked him, what's wrong? And he would not. So he just concludes that Josh is having a bad day. So the bus comes up, and he leads him up on the bus, up the steps of the bus. And he's really reluctant, though. Josh is really reluctant. He's complaining. And as the bus pulls away, all of a sudden, John Mark finds out why his son didn't want to get on the bus. Because the windows were open. And the ridicule and mockery came flowing through the windows. He said it felt like somebody had stuck me in the gut with a knife and just twisted it. He says as that bus drove away, he could see his son stumbling down the aisle, his ears red, looking down, just trying to find a seat. They were laughing at him. They were mocking him, particularly because of an incident the day before with his diapers. And the cat was out of the bag. And he said, can you just imagine, as he drives away, the anger that his daddy felt? His first inclination was to get in his car, flag that bus down, and get back there with those kids and heap a little abuse of his own on their head. And you probably would have felt the same way. Just reading about it makes me feel that way. He wanted to talk to the bus driver. They wanted to talk to the principal. He's going to go all the way to the superintendent. No, he's going to go to all of their parents and let them know what's going on here. And he just got angrier and angrier. And finally, later in the day, he decides to take it all to God in prayer. He could have done it at the beginning of the day, I guess. But he sounds like he's a lot like me. Sometimes I'm just not ready to take it to God. You know? I got to get into my own fallenness with this thing. So he goes to God and he complains. He just opens it up to God and he complains and he complains and he complains. He just lays it out to God, this big complaint. How come he was born like this? And how come you, as the agent of creation, you, the super being of the universe, why couldn't you just heal him? And why do we live in a world where mean people hurt innocent kids? He said it was right at that point that God spoke to him. And God said, I understand. They did the very same thing to my boy. Why? He said, by the way, it provided him a comfort that he still can't explain it, but he says it provides a comfort to him that he still carries with him to this day. My deal is why? Why did he do that? Because you and I are in need. And His strength flows to our weakness, and our weakness flows to Him. You know what happened that day? Something substitutional. Something marvelous. A love that will not let you go. What you going to do with it? Time to decide some stuff as we stand and sing.